Yeah, okay, so first of all, I want to thank Shahid and Nick for their presentations. And I'm just going to touch on, I think, for me, the most salient points about Afropessimism that are actually similar to what Shahid just talked about. When we talk about the normative gaze of the Western imperialist continuum, or to me, I tend to use the phrase white supremacist hegemony, we talk about it in the sense of how it impacts our lived reality. And part of lived reality to me is also the development of epistemological foundations. And what Afropessimism does very problematically is that I think it elides or ignores the theoretical underpinnings of the Black radical tradition and Africana existentialism. And even if you don't even know, if you're not too familiar with what those are, you can just look at it as they pretend Douglass didn't exist, they pretend Anna Julia Cooper didn't exist, and they have a very limited reading of Frantz Fanon. So in those three ways, if you just look at Douglass, Anna Julia Cooper, and Frantz Fanon, you can look at it like, for example, here's a quote from Douglass that completely blows an Afropessimist reading, obliterates it really. In Douglass's lecture on slavery #2, he says this: "Such is the truth of man's right to liberty. It existed in the very idea of man's creation. It was his, in italics, even before he comprehended it." And this is all italics now. "He was created in it," meaning freedom, "endowed with it, and it can never be taken from him. No laws, no statutes, no compacts, no compromises, no constitutions can abrogate or destroy it." Okay, so whenever you're talking about an intrinsic freedom, that's an existential freedom, meaning that as human beings, regardless of our race, but in this case we're talking about Black people and the mechanisms of dehumanization and anti-Black violence that have been created to make us believe that we don't have agency and freedom, but we do. Because one of the things I think Afropessimism also does incorrectly is conflate liberty and freedom. If you think of liberty as something that you have, liberty exists without constraints, meaning you're free to do whatever you want on on the material level. But freedom, this is something very different, because freedom exists whether you're in chains or not. And this is something that Douglass talked about. This is something that David Walker talked about. It's something that Anna Julia, that basically any of the ancestors who rebelled and resisted knew they were free. Otherwise they wouldn't have resisted. So that's something on that level that I think is not properly addressed. So here in this quote, Douglass is talking about an intrinsic existential freedom. Anna Julia Cooper, in her essay, "What Are We Worth?" She was responding to a quote by Henry Beecher, Harriet Beecher Stowe's brother, who was, an abolitionist, who made the remark that if if all Black people were swept off the planet or murdered or killed, there would be no impact on humanity. And this is an abolitionist saying it. So think about that. So Anna Julia Cooper, in response, writes this essay, "What Are We Worth?" And she comes up with what, this is what Lewis Gordon points out, is a value theory of human existence, meaning that people should be worth exactly what they contribute to a society. And given that enslaved Black people contributed labor in the West 400 years for free, that alone makes us worth so much. But then she goes on to point out the number of, for example, African-American inventors and writers who contributed to this country in the face of blatant and violent repression and murder. So that of course we're worth so much. So there's that, okay? Then if we move on to the 20th century, we have Fanon. And this is the problem for me with Afropessimism. I agree with Nick and Shahid that one of its assets is exactly its very biggest flaw. The asset is that it highlights the normative gaze and the stultifying power of that gaze on Black people, so much that anti-Black violence is normalized. But then it's also its biggest flaw because it disregards liberatory aspects of Black thought that predate them as though it didn't exist. And to me, I feel like they're trapped in the normative gaze because they're not looking beyond their own theory to people who came before them and outlined to me very progressive models and ideas about Black emancipation. So in terms of that, so here's the quote by Fanon that Wilderson uses in Red, White, and Black Cinema. he says in chapter 2 of his book, Wilderson cites Fanon, and here's the quote he uses: "Ontology does not permit us to understand the being of the black man, for not only must the black man be black, he must be black in relation to the white man." So there's that one little quote he uses, but he doesn't finish. There's more after that to me would render the quote, his interpretation of the quote, null or void. So the part that he leaves out is when Fanon says, he says here, the key phrase is "in the eyes of the white man," and then Fanon goes on to say that the zone of non-being is an extraordinarily sterile and arid region where an authentic upheaval can be born. And those of you who know Fanon know that this is the crux of it. Yes, this is in his inaugural work, Black Skin, White Masks, and people say it's not radical, but that in itself is radical. He's talking about the upheaval being born from being objectified and the fight to reclaim your humanity in that struggle. And that's what they leave out. So to me, I feel that by leaving out and pretending that, they're on the scene now, and again, we're grappling with some of the points they make excellent points, but they're leaving out an entire tradition. They're leaving out the black radical tradition, they're leaving out Africana existentialism, and if you leave out those two pieces, you are limiting black agency in a way that I think is very, very misleading and potentially damaging. So those are my main points. Let's see if there are a couple of other things I'd like to bring up. One of the things, too, I will say is that if we talk about, for example, in Black Marxism, Cedric Robinson's seminal work, he talks about the fact that enslaved Africans were not, in terms of the struggle and fugitivity and rebellion, it wasn't about amassing numbers of white victims. It was about achieving ontological totality through resistance, meaning a reaffirmation of the humanity they knew they had, but the humanity that was trying to be squelched out of them through the chattel slavery system. So if you look at that, if you look at resistance and agency in that way, then the normative gaze doesn't apply. So when we're talking about the black radical tradition, it really is a direct challenge to the normative gaze, not only in terms of how they relate the slave rebellion, but also in terms of the theoretical underpinnings themselves. So that, to me, is much more emancipatory than focusing solely on, as Shahi was mentioning, the grammar of suffering. The grammar of suffering is useful, but I think we have to go past that. And to do that, all we have to do is go back and look at the writers who came before them, not even just writers, the theorists, the thinkers, like Douglas, like Cooper, like Fanon, who already outlined much more, I think, in not even just practical terms, but historically accurate terms. And because one of the points Shahid made is that the normative gaze sanctions a historical memory. And there it is right in the Afropessimists' own praxis. They themselves are sanctioning a historical memory. One of the things that is also useful is that they've posited the binary of the white human versus the black slave. It's useful in the sense that it allows us to talk about why racism is so permanent. But to me, it's very, very problematic because they're still ceding black agency to the West, meaning that we don't have, not agency, black humanity. They're giving up their humanity and saying, well, because we live in the West, this is how things are, and this is how we are objectified and dehumanized. But I reject that completely. I don't think we should ever cede our humanity. That's what the ancestors fought for, so that we could, even though we're still in the struggle, we have made certain gains, and I'm not even talking about civil and political society, but we have achieved a kind of freedom, or I don't want to say necessarily liberty, but a freedom that they envisioned for us, meaning that we understand who we are in the moment and can be self-directed and self-motivated. So, excuse me, I think the white human, black slave binary is problematic, but also instructive. The other thing that's instructive is Wilderson's claim that white supremacy deputizes white people to commit again, you know, the wanton murder of black people. So that is definitely useful as well, because we see it every day. We see it literally, just like Shahid was saying, okay, it's raining, another black person, unarmed black person was shot by cops. It's sunny, another black person was shot by cops. So in that sense, you know, they do highlight those permanent features of racism in a way that gets people at least talking about the problems of that white supremacist hegemony. But I think for us to really be liberatory in our focus, we can't stop with them. We have to look at the people that they ignore. Because the people that they ignore, like Douglas, like Anna Julia Cooper, like Fanon in their limited reading, offer us so much more than what they are proposing. So I'll close with that.
Before we open up, I just wanted to say one more thing. Like, one thing I do, again, agree with Wilderson with is when he states that for black people, civic stability is a state of emergency. Right. And that's kind of like a compelling call to, again, transcend, because and I think a lot of Afro-pessimist thought is a reaction against the kind of move to kind of conflate, the black liberation struggle, that it can be somehow appeased through the mechanisms of civil society. And so in that sense, I'm 100% with him on that, and I agree that it posits it's not the same as, and he makes the distinction as far as, there's certain conflicts that can be resolved within civil society, but then there's this antagonism that can't be resolved, and then that's what the whole call for the end of the world is, which actually I agree with, but I don't agree with in the literal sense, but I just agree in the sense of, hence, we have to create a new world through emancipatory praxis. Exactly. We cannot continue within the context of the Western imperialist continuum as it is, and so there's an imperative towards emancipatory praxis that again exists there, but it's not fleshed out theoretically. But that's that's left for those of us in the room to do that. Yeah. I know Eunice and LaRose, I'm sure, are gonna get on that. But again, I just wanted to say that because there's definitely some value to it.
Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the People's Republic of the Lower East Side in the shadow of the historic bandshell to commemorate, pay tribute to the 1988 Tompkins Square Park Riot, to all who fought and survived, and to all those who have kept the spirit of rebellion alive here in Tompkins Square. There's been a great change since 1988, gentrification, a virus. But in truth, the gentrification of New York City began on September 12th, 1609. Henry Hudson sailed down what was not yet the Hudson to this island, Manhattan, land of many hills. So named by the Lenape people, the ancient ones of the Northeast Algonquin tribe. Lenape means the real people. They were ready to share. The real people didn't own this land. They were ready to share. They didn't see what was coming. There are a lot of histories in the history of the Lower East Side, but gentrification did land that day. The occupation began. And why? Do you ever wonder why? Why was the Lower East Side always a place for poor and the destitute, the disenfranchised, the teeming masses yearning to be free, the working class, the immigrants, fleeing starvation, persecution? Well, the truth is beneath your feet. Most of this island has a bedrock, a very strong, sturdy, dense schist. Yeah, it's called schist. That's real hard rock. And most of New York City lives on a big pile of schist. Able to support large pilings, steel skyscrapers, but here in the Lower East Side, it is softer. It is softer, marble foundation. This part of the island was salt marshes, swampland, bogs, underground streams. You can't build big in a bog. Pete Missing was right. We are indeed missing foundation here in the Lower East Side. You can't put rich people in a swamp. You can't grow skyscrapers in a swamp. Who are you gonna put in a swamp? The poor, the destitute, the teeming masses yearning to be free. Put them in the swamp! Tompkins Square Park became a park in 1834 when city planning allowed the purchase a package deal of 4 square parks. Washington Square Park, Gramercy, Madison, and Tompkins. Right here. 10 acres of swamp. The original Tompkins. Named after Governor Daniel D. Tompkins. He was a decent guy by most accounts. The city plan was beautification. The plan was to enhance real estate values. The plan was to attract a richer crowd, not the swamp people. To attract the upper crust, but not here. In Tompkins Square, the lower crust. In this 10-acre of community organizing, dissent, protest, creativity, and celebration, we are the lower crust. The people who landed here, they learned how to make this swamp livable, buildable, through escaped slaves and Native Americans squatting by the East River. Early 1800s, mid-1800s, this was a dry dock neighborhood. Irish shipbuilders, escaping the potato famine, escaping English occupation, oppression. Look inside St. Bridget's. Look at the nave, it's a hull of a ship. I'm telling the truth. Then Germans, it was Germantown. Then Eastern Europeans escaping persecution. Truly the huddled masses yearning to escape. Turn of the century and the tenements sprouted. But today we pay tribute. We pay tribute to one of the great battles fought on this ground. The 1988 riot, one for the history books, 30th anniversary. But this riot is not the only one in the history books, not for this park. 1857, the bread riots. People are hungry, people are starving. They're gathering. What are they gonna do? Riot! Riot, riot, riot!
Riot, 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 riot.
1863, Civil War, draft riots. People didn't want to go be forced to fight. What are you gonna do? Riot! Riot, riot, riot!
Riot, 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 riot.
1874, unemployed workers demonstration assembly area, resulted in police beatdown, provoking riot!
Riot,
Riot! 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 Riot!
riot, 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 riot.
You know, this park was closed down during the Civil War, and it was a staging ground for Civil War soldiers. It was closed down, but then, you know, a little later on, like 3 years later, like 1878, the community fought, and they reclaimed this park. They reclaimed this park, and it was renovated and reopened in 1879. 10,000 people in the park. 10,000 park people. How many do I count today? In the 1950s, 60s, Puerto Ricans, African Americans escaping Southern persecution, immigrants from South America, Central America escaping death squads. And so was born Loisaida. Viva Loisaida. East Village, Alphabet City, Lower East Side. Cultural explosion, hippies, drugs, artists, runaways, Tompkins Square Park, a mecca. United Nations, misfits, outcasts, but everyone did not get along. Lots of friction, and not all the good kind. This place was not for the faint of heart. In the 1970s, the blight. Low-income and no-income neighborhood. Lower East Side left to burn. Abandoned buildings and arson. Cheaper for the landlords than paying property tax. Did they think the people were going to leave? No! That would be a no! Where would they go? In the 1970s, going east of Avenue A, you were taking your life into your own hands. Tompkins Square Park was outlaw territory. But the people of the Lower East Side, they had nowhere else to go. So they began to organize, laid claim, took over empty buildings, homesteading, squatting, squat-steading, gardens, community centers, DIY. Again, everyone did not all get along. The park was an epicenter. And in 1988, it was a long, hot summer. Things were heating up. July 31st, the decision came down to impose a 1 a.m. curfew on the park. July 31st, tensions building, starting to boil, small skirmish, warning, don't fuck with us, don't fuck with us, don't fuck with us, don't fuck with us. It wasn't enough, wasn't enough, wasn't enough, wasn't enough, don't fuck with us, don't fuck with us. August 6th, 1988, Saturday, activists put out the call, don't fuck with us, don't fuck with us. Ready to defend, that night they converged in the park. This is our park, this is our park, don't fuck with us, don't fuck with us, this is our park, no curfew. August 6th, 1 a.m., actually technically I guess it's August 7th by then. 1 a.m., on the dot, 1 a.m., on the dot, all the shit hits the fan! All hell breaks loose! Huge groups of protesters, massive gang of riot police, set it off! Riot! 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 What do you do when you're face to face with the gang in blue? What the hell? What the hell? What the hell are you gonna do? Riot! 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 Don't fuck with us.
Don't fuck with us.
What happened next? Perfect episode of Police Gone Wild. Everyone and anyone in the neighborhood, on the street, everyone and anyone beat down, brutally beat down. Part of the protest or not, beat down by police, innocent bystanders assaulted. Police brutality recorded for all time. One of the first times, I think, that full-on, fully united police riot recorded for all time. The curfew didn't stick. No, it didn't stick. It didn't stick. People moved into the park. A lot of shit went down. A lot of shit went down. We remained open. Remained open. And we fought. I'm telling you, we fought. We left everything out on that battlefield. There's no regrets. There's no regrets. Eventually, yeah, eventually the curfew did happen, but we fought. We fought. No regrets. So here, today, we pay tribute to those who fought, to those who retain the spirit of rebellion. Culture, creativity, rebellion, community. And no, we don't always get along. No, we don't always get along. There's too many stories, too many people, too much history. History continues even today. And this is just one story. It's just one story of how the battles were won, how the battles were fought, and how it came to be here today. Tompkins Square, everywhere. Kid Lucky.
Flowing into the mic, I feel it alive. Everything was real on the vibe. As the flow took it on a smooth. As I'm slowly back to do it on groove. I'm thinking about what we had. I'm thinking about what made us mad. Back in the day we fought. And we fought and we fought. Police tried to hold us down. Politicians hold us down. But united we stood. And we didn't stand up around. We just fought for ours. Fought for a place to live, fought for a heart to give. Do any of y'all remember this? Remember food out from bombs, when they kick the food over, in the park out on the side, right here, do you remember when the police came in and beat everybody? That was much of the sin, and we died like there, but we fought right here, and it's really quite clear. We're gonna do it every year. We're gonna fight every time. We're gonna fight with the grind. We're gonna fight with the street. We're gonna fight with our rhyme. Hold up, but it goes something like this. I don't wanna grow up. I'm a Tompkins Square kid. They shoot me up with heroin and look what it did. From cocaine to acid. It's the greatest kind of park I know. I don't wanna grow up, cause maybe if I did, I couldn't be a Tompkins Square kid. More weed, more dust, oh boy, I couldn't be a Tompkins Square kid.
How many people